In the summer of 1944, as Allied forces finally broke out of the Normandy hedgerows and began their advance across France, General George S. Patton made a decision that would define his legacy and change the course of the war in Western Europe. It was a decision that flew in the face of established Allied doctrine that contradicted the explicit orders of his superiors, and that risked not just his career, but potentially the entire Allied campaign in France. Yet it was also a decision that led to one of the most spectacular military advances in history and hastened the defeat of Nazi Germany. Today we're going to explore that decision, why Patton made it, how he justified it to himself and others, and why history has largely vindicated his choice, even though it violated almost every principle of orthodox military doctrine. To understand Patton's decision, we first need to understand what Allied doctrine actually prescribed in the summer of 1944. Allied operational doctrine, as it had evolved through the North African, Sicilian, and Italian campaigns, emphasized methodical advance, maintenance of continuous front lines, systematic clearing of enemy forces, and above all, secure supply lines. This doctrine reflected the influence of British military thinking, which had been shaped by the experience of World War I and the imperative of avoiding another bloodbath of attrition. It also reflected practical concerns about the limitations of Allied logistics, particularly the challenge of supplying armies advancing far from their supply bases. The doctrine called for armies to advance on broad fronts, maintaining contact with adjacent units, ensuring that no significant enemy forces were bypassed that could threaten supply lines, and never advancing faster than supplies could keep up. When an advance outran its logistics, doctrine prescribed that forces halt, allow supply lines to catch up, build up adequate reserves of fuel and ammunition, and only then resume the advance. This was the methodical, systematic approach that had characterized British operations under Montgomery, and that Eisenhower, as Supreme Commander, had largely endorsed as the basis for Allied strategy in Europe. Patton had never been comfortable with this doctrine. His study of military history, particularly the campaigns of the Civil War and the theories of cavalry warfare, had convinced him that speed and momentum were weapons in themselves. He believed that pursuit of a beaten enemy should be relentless, that giving the enemy time to reorganize was the greatest sin a commander could commit, and that logistical concerns, while important, should never be allowed to halt a successful advance. Throughout his career, Patton had chafed against doctrine that prioritized caution over aggression, security over opportunity. The situation in late July and early August 1944 brought this tension between doctrine and Patton's instincts to a crisis point. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy, had shattered German defenses and created exactly the kind of opportunity that Patton lived for. German forces were reeling, retreating in disorder, unable to establish coherent defensive lines. The road to Paris and beyond lay open. This was the moment when pursuit could turn retreat into rout, when aggressive exploitation could destroy an enemy army, rather than merely pushing it back to fight another day. But Allied doctrine and the explicit orders Patton received called for something very different. He was to maintain contact with adjacent units, avoid advancing too far ahead of other Allied armies, ensure his supply lines remained secure, and coordinate his movements with the overall Allied strategy. Most crucially, he was told that when his fuel supplies ran low, he was to halt and allow the logistics system to catch up. The quartermaster officers had calculated how much fuel was available, how far that fuel would take Third Army, and where the advance should stop to await resupply. Patton looked at these orders, looked at the situation on the ground, looked at the fleeing German forces, and made his decision. He would ignore the limits placed on his advance. He would continue attacking regardless of fuel supplies. He would drive forward as long as his tanks could move, and when they ran out of fuel, he would figure something out. This wasn't a decision made in the heat of battle, a spur-of-the-moment choice driven by adrenaline and excitement. It was a calculated, deliberate decision to violate doctrine and orders, because Patton believed the opportunity was too great to pass up. What made this decision so significant wasn't just that it violated doctrine, but that it violated the fundamental assumptions underlying Allied strategy. Eisenhower's broad front strategy was based on the idea that the Allies would advance methodically, keeping all armies moving forward together, presenting the Germans with multiple threats they had to defend against simultaneously. Patton's decision to race ahead of other armies created the very situation that broad front strategy was designed to avoid: a single, deep penetration that exposed flanks and could potentially be cut off by German counterattacks. Patton justified his decision to himself and to his staff with several arguments. First, he argued that the German forces opposing him were so disorganized and demoralized that they couldn't mount effective counterattacks against his flanks or supply lines. Second, he contended that the opportunity to destroy German forces west of the Rhine was fleeting, that every day of delay gave the Germans time to reorganize and establish new defensive lines. Third, he believed that logistical limitations could be overcome through improvisation, that his forces could capture German fuel depots, requisition civilian vehicles, and generally live off the land to supplement inadequate supplies from Allied logistics. Most fundamentally, Patton argued that conventional doctrine was designed for conventional situations, and this was not a conventional situation. The German army in France was in the process of disintegrating. Units were losing contact with headquarters, commanders didn't know where their own forces were, and the retreat was rapidly becoming a panicked flight. In Patton's view, applying peacetime training manual solutions to a situation like this was criminally stupid. The doctrine that said, "halt when you run out of fuel," assumed you'd be facing an organized enemy who could take advantage of any pause. But if the enemy was equally disorganized, if they were retreating faster than you could pursue, then stopping to wait for fuel was simply allowing them to escape. When Patton explained his reasoning to his staff, he used a hunting metaphor. He said that when you had a wounded animal on the run, you pursued it relentlessly until it was down. You didn't stop to make camp and have dinner while the wounded animal got away. The German army was that wounded animal, and this was the moment to finish it. Everything else, all the logistics concerns and doctrinal requirements, were secondary to the fundamental imperative of destroying the enemy's capacity to resist. The decision Patton made wasn't a single moment, but rather a series of escalating commitments. First, when his fuel supplies ran lower than doctrine prescribed, he didn't halt, but continued advancing, gambling that he'd receive more fuel before his tanks completely ran dry. When that additional fuel didn't arrive in the quantities promised, he didn't halt, but instead began scrounging fuel from wherever he could find it. When his superiors explicitly ordered him to slow down, he claimed, communications problems, and continued advancing. Each step took him further from compliance with orders and deeper into insubordination. What's remarkable is that Patton wasn't hiding what he was doing. He was quite open with his staff about his intentions to ignore supply limitations and continue advancing. He told his commanders that if they ran out of fuel, they should capture German supplies, commandeer civilian vehicles, do whatever it took to keep moving. He made it clear that he would accept any excuse for continuing to advance, but would accept no excuses for halting. This created a command climate where subordinates understood that Patton expected them to be as creative in overcoming obstacles as he was in ignoring orders from higher headquarters. The results of Patton's decision were dramatic and immediate. Third Army advanced across France at a rate that astonished both allies and enemies. In 2 weeks, Patton's forces covered distances that had taken months to traverse in World War I. They liberated hundreds of French towns and villages, captured tens of thousands of German prisoners, and destroyed or scattered German units that might have formed the nucleus of organized resistance. By any measure of military effectiveness, measured in ground gained, enemy casualties inflicted, and speed of advance, Patton's violation of doctrine was spectacularly successful. But success on the battlefield didn't mean Patton's decision was uncontroversial. His superiors, particularly Omar Bradley, who commanded 12th Army Group, were appalled by Patton's disregard for orders and doctrine. Bradley understood logistics better than Patton did, or at least he paid more attention to logistical realities. He knew that the fuel Patton was burning in his race across France was fuel that other armies needed. He knew that Patton's advance was creating a bulge in the Allied line that exposed flanks and complicated the overall strategic picture. He knew that at some point, Patton's tanks would run completely out of fuel, and if that happened, while German forces were still capable of counterattacking, the results could be catastrophic. Eisenhower was caught in an impossible position. As Supreme Commander, he couldn't simply allow one of his army commanders to ignore orders and violate doctrine whenever he felt like it. That way lay chaos and the complete breakdown of military discipline. But Eisenhower also couldn't ignore the fact that Patton was achieving spectacular results. Third Army was advancing, German forces were being destroyed, and the Allied position in France was improving dramatically every day. Relieving Patton from command for insubordination would hand the Germans a propaganda victory and deprive the Allies of their most aggressive field commander at the moment when that aggression was paying enormous dividends. The solution Eisenhower arrived at was a kind of unofficial tolerance. He would issue orders to Patton to slow down and stay within his supply limits. Patton would acknowledge those orders and then ignore them. Eisenhower would refrain from taking action against Patton as long as the results remained positive. It was a pragmatic compromise that allowed Eisenhower to maintain the fiction of command authority, while allowing Patton to continue his unauthorized offensive. But it created dangerous precedents and sent confusing messages to other commanders about whether doctrine and orders were actually binding. The fuel crisis that Bradley and the logisticians had warned about did eventually arrive. By early September 1944, Third Army's tanks were literally running out of fuel. Patton's forward units were grinding to a halt, not because of German resistance, but because they couldn't move. This was exactly the situation that doctrine was designed to prevent. Patton's response was to blame everyone but himself. He accused the logistics command of incompetence, accused Bradley of favoring Montgomery over American forces, accused Eisenhower of lacking the vision to see that Third Army could end the war if only given adequate supplies. What Patton never publicly acknowledged was that his own decision to advance beyond his supply lines had contributed significantly to the fuel crisis. The logistics system had been designed to support a methodical advance at predictable rates. Patton's rapid advance had outrun those calculations. The fuel existed in Allied supply depots, but it was hundreds of miles behind the front lines, and the transportation system couldn't move it forward fast enough to keep up with Third Army's consumption. If Patton had advanced at the rate Doctrine prescribed, the fuel would have been adequate. But Patton had gambled that momentum was worth the risk of outrunning supplies, and when that gamble caught up with him, he refused to accept responsibility. The debate over whether Patton's decision was correct has occupied military historians for decades. On one side are those who argue that Patton's aggressive pursuit in August 1944 destroyed German forces that could never be reconstituted, shortened the war by months, and demonstrated the value of aggressive leadership over cautious doctrine. They point out that the German forces Patton scattered in France never reformed into effective fighting units, that German commanders later confirmed that they had been on the verge of complete collapse, and that only the pause in the Allied advance in September allowed them to stabilize their lines. On the other side are historians who argue that Patton's advance, while spectacular, was ultimately strategically sterile. They note that Third Army's race across France didn't capture any objectives of strategic importance, that German forces, while scattered, were not destroyed in the kind of encirclement battles that would have prevented them from fighting again, and that Patton's consumption of scarce fuel contributed to the failure of Montgomery's Market Garden operation in September. They argue that a more balanced allocation of resources among Allied armies might have achieved better strategic results than concentrating resources on Patton's headline-grabbing, but ultimately indecisive advances. What both sides of this debate often miss is that Patton's decision wasn't really about logistics or strategy in the abstract. It was about Patton's fundamental belief that warfare was about will and momentum as much as it was about resources and planning. Patton believed that the side that wanted to win more, that was willing to take greater risks and accept greater hardships, would ultimately prevail. He believed that giving the enemy time to recover, for any reason, was the cardinal sin of warfare. And he believed that conventional doctrine, developed in peacetime by staff officers who had never commanded in combat, was fundamentally inadequate for the chaos and opportunities of actual battle. This belief system, this philosophy of warfare, was what made Patton both brilliant and dangerous. It allowed him to achieve results that more conventional commanders couldn't match. But it also made him fundamentally unsuited for coalition warfare, where coordination and cooperation mattered as much as individual initiative. Patton's decision to ignore doctrine and orders might have been militarily sound in the immediate tactical situation, but it created problems for the larger Allied strategy that relied on different armies working together toward common objectives. The historical verdict on Patton's decision must account for both what happened and what might have happened. What happened was that Third Army's August offensive destroyed German cohesion in France, captured vast territories, and created conditions for the eventual Allied victory. what might have happened had German forces been more capable or Allied logistics more constrained was that Patton's exposed spearheads could have been cut off, creating a disaster that could have set back the entire Allied campaign. The fact that the disaster didn't happen doesn't mean the risk wasn't real. One aspect of Patton's decision that deserves more attention is how he convinced his subordinates to follow him in violating doctrine. Military organizations run on obedience to orders and adherence to doctrine. Soldiers are trained to follow procedures, to do things by the book, to check with higher authority before taking unusual actions. Patton had to overcome all of that institutional inertia to get his army to advance faster and farther than doctrine allowed. He did this through a combination of personal leadership, cultivation of an aggressive command climate, and his own willingness to take responsibility for the consequences. Patton told his commanders that he would back them up if they got in trouble for being too aggressive, but he would relieve them if they were too cautious. He made it clear that he valued initiative over compliance, results over procedures. He personally visited frontline units to emphasize the importance of maintaining momentum. And he created a mythology around Third Army, a sense that they were special, that they could achieve things other armies couldn't, that they were writing history with every mile they advanced. This psychological dimension of leadership was perhaps as important as any tactical decision in enabling Third Army's spectacular advances. The other Allied armies, watching Third Army's race across France, had mixed reactions. Some commanders were inspired by Patton's example and pushed their own forces to advance more aggressively. Others resented that Patton was getting fuel and supplies they needed, that his headline-grabbing advances were overshadowing their own steady progress, and that his violations of doctrine were being tolerated while they were expected to follow the rules. This created tensions within the Allied command structure that complicated Eisenhower's already difficult job of maintaining coalition unity. British commanders, particularly Montgomery, were particularly critical of Patton's approach. Montgomery believed in what he called balanced operations, where advances were carefully prepared, adequately supplied, and methodically executed. From Montgomery's perspective, Patton was a cowboy whose reckless advances achieved nothing of lasting strategic value while consuming resources that could have been used for properly planned operations. The fact that Patton's methods were being rewarded with publicity and praise, while Montgomery's more careful approach was being criticized as too slow, created resentment that poisoned relations between British and American commanders. The debate over Patton's decision ultimately raises fundamental questions about military doctrine itself. Is doctrine meant to be a set of iron laws that must be followed regardless of circumstances? Or is it a set of guidelines that commanders should adapt to specific situations? Military theorists have struggled with this question for centuries. Too much flexibility in doctrine becomes meaningless, every commander doing whatever he wants. Too much rigidity in doctrine prevents commanders from exploiting opportunities or responding to unexpected situations. Patton's answer to this question was clear. He believed doctrine was useful for training and for ordinary situations, but that great commanders had to know when to ignore doctrine in favor of what the specific situation demanded. He saw himself as that kind of great commander, someone whose judgment and instincts were more reliable guides than any manual or doctrine. This was an enormously arrogant position, but it was also the position of most of history's successful commanders. Alexander, Hannibal, Napoleon, and Lee had all succeeded partly by knowing when to violate the conventional wisdom of their times. The problem with Patton's approach is that it only works if the commander's judgment is actually superior to doctrine. If a commander violates doctrine and succeeds, he looks like a genius. If he violates doctrine and fails, he looks like a reckless fool who got his men killed for nothing. Patton's decision in August 1944 succeeded, which vindicated his judgment. But there were other times in his career when his aggressive instincts led him into trouble, when the risks he took didn't pay off. The slapping incidents in Sicily, for example, were the result of Patton's belief that his personal code of warrior conduct was more important than military regulations about treatment of soldiers. What made Patton's decision particularly significant was its timing. August 1944 was the moment when the Allies transitioned from the attritional fighting in Normandy to mobile warfare across France. This transition required a different mindset, different tactics, and different priorities. Doctrine that had been appropriate for the Normandy hedgerows was less appropriate for the open terrain of central France. Patton understood this transition instinctively and adapted immediately. More conventional commanders took longer to adjust, still thinking in terms of the methodical advances that had been necessary in Normandy. The German response to Patton's advance reveals how effective his decision to ignore doctrine actually was. German commanders reported that they couldn't establish defensive lines because Third Army was advancing faster than they could retreat. Units would begin to dig in, only to discover that American forces had already bypassed their positions and were in their rear. The psychological impact on German soldiers of this relentless pursuit was devastating. Many units simply disintegrated, with soldiers abandoning their weapons and heading for home, rather than trying to retreat in organized formations. This psychological dimension of Patton's offensive is often overlooked in analyses that focus on miles advanced or fuel consumed. By refusing to give German forces time to reorganize, Patton prevented them from regaining their morale and fighting effectiveness. Every day of relentless pressure was another day when German commanders couldn't consolidate their forces, couldn't establish command and control, couldn't plan effective resistance. This cumulative effect of sustained offensive pressure was worth something, though it's difficult to quantify exactly how much. Patton's decision also had implications for post-war military doctrine. The U.S. Army studied Third Army's campaigns extensively in the years after World War II, trying to derive lessons about mobile warfare, pursuit operations, and the role of audacity in military operations. Some of these lessons were incorporated into doctrine, though with appropriate caveats about the need to maintain supply lines and coordinate with adjacent units. The tension between Patton's aggressive approach and more methodical doctrinal approaches has remained a feature of American military thinking ever since. In evaluating Patton's decision, we must also consider the alternatives. What would have happened if Patton had followed doctrine, halted when his fuel ran low, and waited for supplies to catch up? The German forces would have gained time to retreat in better order, to establish defensive positions, to reorganize their command structure. The war in Europe might have lasted longer, though it's impossible to say exactly how much longer. More Allied soldiers would have died fighting through German defensive lines that Patton's pursuit could have prevented. These counterfactual considerations suggest that while Patton's decision violated doctrine and created problems, the alternatives might have been worse. The ultimate irony of Patton's decision is that it succeeded, partly because it was unexpected. German commanders knew Allied doctrine as well as Allied commanders did. They planned their defenses and retreats based on the assumption that Allied forces would advance methodically, would halt when supplies ran short, would follow the predictable patterns that doctrine prescribed. Patton's willingness to ignore doctrine meant that his actions were unpredictable, which gave him a significant advantage. If every Allied commander had operated like Patton, the advantage would have disappeared, because the Germans would have adjusted their expectations. Patton's effectiveness depended partly on other commanders following doctrine, creating the predictability against which his unpredictability stood out. In the end, Patton's decision to ignore Allied doctrine in August 1944 was vindicated by results. But that doesn't mean it was unambiguously correct, or that it should be held up as a model for all commanders to follow. It was a calculated risk that paid off in specific circumstances, taken by a commander whose personality and capabilities were suited to that kind of aggressive, improvisational warfare. It shortened the war, destroyed enemy forces, and demonstrated the continuing relevance of offensive spirit in an age of mass mechanized warfare. But it also created logistical problems, strained alliance relationships, and established dangerous precedents about obedience to orders and adherence to doctrine. The legacy of Patton's decision is complex and contested. For some, it represents the triumph of boldness over bureaucracy, proof that great commanders must sometimes ignore the rule book to achieve great results. For others, it represents the kind of undisciplined risk-taking that could have led to disaster if circumstances had been slightly different. Both interpretations contain truth. Patton's decision worked, but it worked in large part because of factors beyond his control, including German weakness, Allied air superiority, and the industrial capacity that allowed the United States to produce enough fuel that even Patton's wasteful consumption didn't fatally compromise other operations. What we can say with certainty is that Patton's decision to ignore doctrine and push forward regardless of supply limitations was characteristic of his approach to warfare and his personality. He was a man who believed that audacity and will could overcome material obstacles, that momentum once gained should never be surrendered, and that the greatest sin in warfare was allowing a beaten enemy time to recover. These beliefs led him to make a decision that violated every principle of methodical warfare, and that decision contributed to one of the most spectacular advances in military history. Whether that makes him a genius or a lucky gambler is a question that historians will continue to debate, but the results speak for themselves.